What's the difference between an invention and an innovation? An invention is a new thing, a widget, a gadget, a Phillips head screwdriver, or Angry Birds on your iPhone. But innovations are different in a fundamental way. They change the pattern of our lives, individually, collectively, and over history. Innovations can happen in small ways. They can also happen in very big and profound ways that change the course of history. We're living through one of those moments right now. You may feel it when Facebook updates the way it works every 6 weeks, or when there's more new widgets and gadgets out there than you can possibly keep up with or learn. The pace of change is absolutely extraordinary. How many people feel overwhelmed by the rate of change right now? I feel that way too, right? Something extraordinary is going on, and I hope today that we can dig into it and understand it and its impact on our tradition a little bit better. Judaism has always worked and functioned in an ecosystem. We have lived in relation not only to one another in space and time, but also in relationship to the outside forces, political, circumstantial, social, geographic, whatever, that have influenced Judaism and our culture and tradition. Sometimes we seek to align ourselves with those things quite closely. Imagine linking arms with Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement as an expression of our values and solidarity with other people in our ecosystem. Or imagine the laws of kosher wine, which were designed to create some separation from secular society quite purposefully in order to draw boundaries about who we are and also who we're not. So I'm a Gen Xer. I grew up with 8mm tape for my family movies. I lived through VHS and Betamax and that whole debate, through laser discs and DVDs, all the way up to TiVo, which now I don't use anymore because I stream Netflix on my iPad. I am used to change. People of my generation, and particularly those younger than I am, are so used to change, it's all we've ever known. So we're adaptable, we're nimble. We're like somebody on a boat in rough seas where you have to have a little give in your knees so that you don't get knocked over when things shift a little this way or that. Today, we need to be nimble in order to keep up with the changing times. The question is, where do we adapt? Where do we leap forward as things are changing at this frenetic pace? And where do we say, no, we actually are going to be slow to adapt and change. We are tethered to tradition, and it doesn't change quickly. In fact, quite purposefully, it changes very slowly. Today, I want to take you through a few examples in human history and also in Jewish history of these kinds of innovations and also the revolutions that they have catalyzed, to understand the relationship between these two things in order to ask ourselves the question, what are we going to do as Jewish leaders and as the Jewish community at this moment of change? Let's start about 400,000 years ago, when humans first learned how to control fire. Homo erectus learned how to use this particular tool for all sorts of important things. Fire provided heat and light, which were very valuable to keep predators at bay in the middle of the night, and to allow us to venture into territory that otherwise would have been too cold to inhabit. 400,000 years ago, this innovation was the first step of globalization, we could say. But getting fire under our control actually had a much more profound impact. It allowed us to, A, get more nutrients from our current diet, and B, expand to include more diverse things in our diet. So that provided some security and fitness, right, in Darwin's terms, to survive better. But the result of that was that our digestive tracts got smaller and our teeth and our jawbones shrank. And with the resources that otherwise would have built up those parts of our bodies, our heads grew larger. So we can see one innovation actually had biological revolutionary consequences that have led to all of us being here today. Let's look at another slightly more modern example, the printing press. Gutenberg in 1440 assembled many pieces, individual inventions that had already existed, but he put them together into an innovation that really changed the world. The printing press did not just create lots of books that could be distributed. It had very fundamental impact. So before the printing press, you'd copy a book by handwriting it, right? Scribes were well paid and painstakingly worked to copy one by one by one. When the printing press is invented, unless you're writing Torah scrolls, first of all, the scribe's out of a job. We can look at the newspaper and magazine industry that's struggling today and see something analogous there where careers and professions are changing. More people were able to express themselves in the written word. And many, many, many more people were able to get their hands on books to understand what other people were writing about and thinking. There was a democratization of knowledge and information, and also a standardization of how we capture knowledge and information that has strongly influenced our scientific and knowledge-based world today. But the most important lesson from the printing press is not about careers or the number of books. It's about literacy. Because before the printing press, when each individual book was ridiculously expensive, only the wealthy and the elite got their hands on their books and really had any use for knowing how to read. Once books are ubiquitous, everywhere, easily accessible and cheap, now the lay people learn how to read. And not only do they read this book and that book, but they go to school, they get educated, and they start to participate in civic society. That's a game changer. The Protestant Reformation happened because of literacy made possible by the printing press. Innovation, revolution. So let's turn to Jewish history. The Exodus from Egypt, right? We could see this as a moment in time. We had lice and boils and frogs and darkness, and poof, we were out of there. But the story, as you well know, is much more complex than that. William Bridges, in his book Managing Transitions, talks about how change is situational, but transition is psychological. Very different things. And I think that distinction is very useful as we navigate our crazy change-filled waters these days. So we left Egypt, and we're wandering in the desert, and the people are going crazy because all the rules of the game have changed. Today, we're also seeing that many rules of the game are changing, right? So what did the people need? They needed leadership, and they needed new rules. So Moshe provided some of that. He knew that he needed to build trust and get people's cooperation, that simply controlling from the top down wasn't going to unify the people in the way that he needed. So we can learn some interesting leaderships from this. But in addition, we needed another intervention, which was new rules of the game. When the Torah was given to us at Mount Sinai, it provided that structure that we needed. Without it, we were doing ridiculous things like making golden calves, but now we had some template for what life as freedom fighters would look like compared to being ex-slaves. So what did the Jewish people say when they received the Torah at Mount Sinai? They said, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do, and then we will understand. Now we can understand these few words in, I think, two different ways that are very important for our current story today. First of all, we can see it as a declaration of faith. We will do all that God has said. We're not going to question it. We'll understand it later. But more important than that, and perhaps more relevant to today's circumstances, is the idea of constant iterations of learning. That there is no end to learning and understanding. It is a continual process. We adapt. And in a moment of constant change, I think this is a very important ethos for us to understand as Jews, to help us mitigate the decisions between leaping into the future and taking gigantic risks versus staying incredibly rigid with what we are today, resisting modernity and the changes that are upon us. Obviously, somewhere in between lies the answer, but that's a big gray space that we're going to have to figure out together. So the permanent beta idea, Gmail, for example, had a big red beta on their site for years and years, even after there were millions and millions of users. Gmail didn't take beta off because it decided it was in an alpha stage, that the development and the creative process were done. Gmail took off the beta because they realized there would never be an alpha stage. It is a permanent beta, constant iterations. In dialogue with its users and developers, it would continue to evolve. So I think we can learn something about the permanent beta stage for our lives today. Another example is how we've used communication over time and space. So when the new moon was seen in Jerusalem and the new month declared, how did we convey that information to Jews who had moved far and wide through the region? We didn't have telephones, no texting, so we had to rely on a different sort of innovation to communicate that information. I loved learning when I was studying in Jerusalem after college about this story where someone would declare the new month in Jerusalem and a messenger would run up a hill and light a fire. And then somebody way over there would see the fire and they'd run up on their hilltop and light another fire. Fire by fire by fire, mountaintop by mountaintop, conveying that it was a new month. Now, why was this so important? Because as Jews, we have a gravitational center, a backbone of our tradition that is about time. It is about the calendar, and it required that we all celebrate the same thing at the same time on the same day. And when the calendar was based on one person declaring something and communicating that information across time and space, this mattered a lot. Great innovation to communicate what is the foundation of our tradition. Another example from Jewish history is the Talmud, right? Talk about radical. Taking an oral law and committing it to a rigid form. This was a complete game changer in our tradition. We might take it for granted now, but looking back at history, this was a massive innovation that had really significant implications. Now, what I think is fascinating about the Talmud is that it's not just a snippet in time. It's conversations and connections among many people throughout a lot of time, woven together. So not only is it committing the oral law to paper, it's the way that it is done and what it represents in our tradition about wrestle, about conversation, and about the network that defines who we are. So we've seen through these few different examples that we have a strong tradition of innovation and revolution in human history and also in Jewish history. These changes today are just one more example of that happening, and we together will need to figure out how to manage that. Today, with our technologies, individuals are more empowered than they have ever been before, with the freedom of expression, collaboration, and collective action. The recent events of the Arab Spring are a great testament to the power and the potential revolutionary consequences of these innovations. So while the printing press may have changed Christianity and the Talmud may have changed Judaism, we also are looking at technologies today and need to ask ourselves the question, how will these change us? Every stage of history, we rework our relationship with the forces outside of ourselves, and we're in the process of doing that right now. This is a map of my network on LinkedIn. You can create one too. And it illustrates how the connections between and among people are a fabric woven together, right? Every thread of a fabric has a certain amount of strength. And the more threads and the more tightly they're woven and the individual strength of each individual thread make up the fabric of our community. It is these connections and relationships, not just programs, that strengthen our community and will hold our future together in important and interesting ways. So isn't it so interesting that today's revolution is a communications revolution? I think what we are experiencing these days actually holds tremendous opportunity for Judaism. On the one hand, we may think that it's very threatening, that synagogues might be posting tweets on the wall at Shabbat services and it will undermine everything that we know and have done. But I actually have faith in humanity, and I have faith in us and in our tradition. As things are spinning out of control, the tweets are flying, and we feel like we're plugged in on a nearly 24/7 basis, and it's all overwhelming us. Isn't it interesting that the latest books to come out and the hottest speakers are talking about how to slow down and unplug and turn off? It is fascinating, therefore, that our tradition has an answer, not surprisingly, to this modern dilemma. Shabbat gives us an opportunity to both engage in the modern world, in our networks, in our connections with each other throughout time, throughout space, with our ancestors, and with our tradition. And yet we also have this wonderful space that provides us sanity and exactly what we need to bring our tradition forward. Thank you.